Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is someone with a lot of insight and a scholar of international repute for this very subject at the Population Council. He was recently also invited at the Vatican by the Pope to discuss the matter of population in the Western world, in Europe, and the Christian world. He joined the Council in 1973 following a postdoctoral fellowship in the population dynamics at the Johns Hopkins University. It's also very important to see how the world views Pakistan and our population. We want to make the most of this dividend of a youthful population, of a population that has a big component of young children. But are we as a state, as a society, providing them with the best preparation for the world of tomorrow? Speaking on the subject of the new demographic realities of Pakistan, please join me in welcoming the Vice President and the distinguished speaker from the Population Council, New York, Dr. John Bongaarts.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Your Excellency, the Prime Minister, Honorable Chief Justice, Honorable Speakers of the National Assembly and Senate, Prime Minister of AJK, Chief Ministers of the provinces, ladies and gentlemen. As you have just heard, the population of Pakistan has grown very rapidly over recent decades. In 1947, there were 30 million Pakistanis. Today, there are more than 200 million. So that's a six-fold increase. And the projections now indicate that by the end of the century, the population will reach somewhere between 350 and 400 million. Clearly, this is not a desirable trend, and the question then is, what can we do respecting human rights and respecting women's well-being? What can we do about this trend? My assignment here is to review demographic trends and then discuss the role of family planning programs and the multi-sectoral benefits that can be gained from family planning. So let me start with slides, and let me see. This slide shows the overall trend in population from 1950, about 30 million, to today. The recent census indicated that the population is 208 million. The red line then projects the numbers taken from the latest UN projections, and they indicate 352 million. I should mention, however, that this estimate was made 2 years ago, before the results of the census came in and before the results of the latest DHS survey came in. And both of these items of information leads me to believe that the projection that the UN will make next will be higher than 352 million and could well be 400 million. So imagine what that means. Instead of 200 million, 400 million Pakistanis. Every thing made by man in Pakistan will have to be rebuilt. You have to build every building, every home, every school, every clinic, every road, every bridge that you now have will have to be rebuilt. And if that is somehow managed, you end up with the same quality of life that you have now, because there are also twice as many people. Clearly, that's not a desirable investment of resources. So the question is, how can we slow this projection? I should also mention the next slide. Compares the trajectories of Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. And here on this axis we have the ratio of the population in the future related to today's population. So the top line is Pakistan, which will expect it to roughly double by the year 2100. Instead, if you look at India and Bangladesh, the green and the yellow line, we are expected to grow by 10 or 20% more and then decline. So the growth rate in Pakistan is much higher. You've heard growth rates. Even a small change in the growth rate has a very large impact on population in the long run. So the question then is, well, why are the trends for Pakistan so different from India and Bangladesh? And the first answer is, next slide. Okay. The first answer in the causal chain is the trend in fertility. This graph shows the trends in the fertility of women expressed in the number of births per woman from 1950 to today. And looking at the estimates in the 50s and 60s, we see that Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh had very high fertility, roughly 6 births per woman. The first country to begin to see a decline was India, the yellow line, in the 70s. And a steady, slow decline leaves India now with about 2.5 births per woman. Bangladesh didn't see very much decline in the 60s and 70s, but in the 80s, a very sharp decline began, and it caught up with India in the recent decade. Pakistan's line, the red line, stays high until around 1990 and then begins to decline. And we see a steady difference between Pakistan and India and Bangladesh of about a birth and a half. And that difference of a birth and a half is sufficient to lead to much higher population growth in the long run. So why are fertility trends different? Here, next slide. Here we have the trends in contraceptive use for all 3 countries. Back in the 1960s, contraceptive use was almost absent in all 3 countries, in fact in all of Asia. In the 1970s, India's contraceptive use levels started rising, but fairly slowly. And Bangladesh, it started in the 80s, and its increase was much more rapid. So Bangladesh has actually overtaken India in terms of contraceptive use. The red line shows Pakistan, where relatively little happened until the 80s and the early 90s. Then a slow decline in contraceptive use occurred, and it now stands at about 35. Interestingly, and perhaps worryingly, the rate of contraceptive use in the last few years has leveled off in Pakistan. If this continues, it will be a serious problem for the long run. I'm not sure, because sometimes these data have errors, but this is a sign that should be taken attention to. And then the final question is, why are contraceptive use levels so different between these countries? And the next slide shows why that is the case. The big blue arrows in these graphs point to the time at which the family planning program began seriously in these countries. So the yellow line, India, they had the first program starting actually in the 60s, but really gearing up in the 70s. 1980, Bangladesh made a big push and invested greatly in a nationwide family planning program. And Pakistan is about a decade later before it began a serious investment in family planning program. So in short, investments in family planning raise contraceptive use, lower fertility, and lower population growth. So next, I want to speak briefly about the role of family planning programs and how family planning programs actually affect the contraceptive use level. Family planning programs, of course, provide contraceptive access, they build clinics, they train staff, and the objective of that activity is twofold. First is to reduce the unmet need for contraception, and secondly, providing information to women and couples raise the demand, or crystallize the demand for contraception. So these are two separate and very important roles for the program. Let me explain what I mean by unmet need for contraception. The bottom line here shows the contraceptive use trend for Pakistan, which started at about 10%. 10% of married women used contraception in 1990. That rose to about 30% in 2010 and is leveling off or perhaps declining a little bit. These are women who don't want to get pregnant and are using contraception. But there are many more women who don't want to get pregnant and are not using contraception. And that number is given by the top line. That is called the demand for contraception. That is, all women who do not want to get pregnant should be using contraception, but many of them are not. So in 1990, if you compare the blue and the red line, you see that the majority of women who don't want to get pregnant were not using contraception. But over time, the gap between the blue and the red line has narrowed, and that is called the unmet need. So unmet need has come to decline as a result of the efforts made by the family planning program. But there's two things to worry about here. First, unmet need is still high, and secondly, the leveling off of use is largely due to the leveling of the demand for contraception. So this means that it is not just a matter of unmet need, but also of information for women about. This slide compares Pakistan with India and Bangladesh. So the red part is simply the contraceptive use levels. Contraceptive use in Pakistan is about 34%, in India it's about 60%, and in Bangladesh it is. Now there's two reasons why Pakistan contraceptive use level is lower than in Bangladesh and India. The first is the blue part, the unmet need, is higher in Pakistan than in India and Bangladesh. So that's an obvious part to work on to reduce unmet need. Secondly, the demand is lower in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. So in order to catch up to the levels of India and Bangladesh, we need to both work on the unmet need and on the demand for contraception. And finally, I must say, the reason, the result of the unmet need, if there are women who have an unmet need, that is women who want to avoid pregnancy and are not using contraception, that leads to unintended pregnancies. There are about 5 million unintended pregnancies in Pakistan every year and about 2 million abortions. So there's no question that there's a very large amount of unmet need in this country. Finally, a brief look at the benefits of family planning programs. In the past, family planning programs have often been seen as strictly health interventions and as human rights intervention, giving women the right to choose the number and spacing of their children. But there are many more benefits that research has now shown that family planning programs have a wide range of benefits. And next slide. The benefits are economic, they're in health, they're in human rights, they're environmental, and they're governmental. Let me say a word about each one of them. On the economic front, we have what is called the demographic dividend. Next slide. Yeah. The demographic dividend refers to a boost to the GDP per capita, a boost that can last for decades. And that dividend has been very clearly demonstrated in the Asian tigers in the 70s and 80s. Taiwan, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia have greatly benefited from their very rapid decline in fertility, and they received a boost to their economy from the program. It's calculated that the return on family planning investment is 120 to 1. That is $1 invested in family planning programs returns $120 in other sectors. And finally, and equally important, reducing fertility reduces unemployment. As you know, Pakistan, about half of Pakistan's population is under age 20. These young people are aging and looking for jobs. Many times these jobs are not available, and therefore these youth are unemployed. By reducing fertility, we reduce the demand for jobs, and we reduce unemployment. Very important. Then the benefits of health. First of all, each pregnancy is associated with a risk to mortality and morbidity. So fewer births means reduced maternal mortality. Improved infant and child mortality. And then, of course, fewer abortions. As I mentioned, there are 2 million abortions every year in Pakistan. That is really too much. Human rights. Family planning brings greater freedom to determine the number and spacing of children. Women often do not have this choice right now. On the environment, very important in a country like Pakistan. Slower population growth will reduce pressure on natural resources. Water is a very important part. Agriculture, energy, and so on. And with fewer people, reduced air, water, and soil pollution. And finally, At the governmental level, the government is struggling to provide services, schooling, clinics, roads, etc. With slower population growth, there will be increased resources per capita for schooling, healthcare sectors, and infrastructure. So that makes it possible to improve the quality of education. The question then is, well, if we invest in family planning, how much difference does that make to the future population? And this slide gives a partial response to that. The red line is the UN projection, which ends up at around 360 million. The two blue lines give the high and the low variant. The high variant reaches about 500 million people, and that is the trajectory that Pakistan is on unless it makes further effort. The lower curve is the low variant, and it means that we have to reduce fertility by half a birth below the current trajectory, which is not difficult with a good program. And in that case, you would end up with a population of about 200 million, or a little bit above 2 million. So adding, slowing down fertility would add 200 million people to the future. Investing in family planning and reducing fertility might reduce the total to 200 million. So clearly, a small change in fertility can have a very large impact on future population. So my conclusion is that Pakistan is expected to grow by about 150 million, possibly 200 million by the end of the century. Family planning programs have demonstrated to raise demand and reduce unmet need, and thereby reducing fertility and population growth. And substantial socioeconomic, environmental, health, and governmental benefits follow from fertility decline. Finally, a word about policy implications. It's crucial that we recognize the multi-sectoral benefits of family planning and slow population growth. Family planning is not just a health investment. Family planning helps and benefits all sectors of the economy. So you have to make family planning a development priority, not just a health priority. And of course, we have to increase investments in family planning and mainstream family planning in the healthcare sector, which is not the case at the moment. So thank you very much. Let me say in conclusion that this is an extremely important event for Pakistan, and I believe that the strong attention from the high government officials that population now received will greatly benefit the population of Pakistan. Thank you.